Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to today's virtual meeting where we're going to focus on the COVID-19 impact on state education budgets. My name is Michelle Ekstrom, and I'm the Group Director at the National Conference of State Legislatures. And today we will have the wonderful opportunity to hear directly from our education experts at NCSL on what we are thinking about the impact that the pandemic is going to have on our state budgets. Today, I would just like to review, Dan, can you advance the slide? Thank you. Today, I'm going to quickly run through the agenda for the virtual meeting, and then we'll discuss some protocols for the call. First, we're going to be talking about what was the impact of the Great Recession on education finance. And we're looking back at this really for some comparative data so that we can draw some comparisons and perhaps understand what will be happening going forward. The second part of the webinar will be how will key revenue sources behave compared to the Great Recession. What is happening today with school and district finances. We'll also be talking about what can we expect and how can states act proactively. During this opportunity, we will be breaking for questions, so I suggest that you please feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat box that's on the right-hand side of your screen. Sorry, I'm going to pause and admit some more folks who appear to be in our virtual waiting room. I do want to go over some protocols for today's opportunities so that we can get through this really smoothly and have everyone participate and get all of their questions answered. First of all, if you are joining us by phone, I would highly encourage you to log into your computer, click on that Zoom link, and join us by your computer. It's much easier for you to participate. You're able to see the slides that we have prepared, and you'll also be able to ask questions in our chat box as well. So we would ask you to do that. If you're not able to do that, I'm going to pause here in just a moment and ask you to identify yourself so that we know who is joining us by phone. That's for a couple of reasons, just so we have a sense of who's on the call, but also we're really mindful of security protocols and other concerns for privacy that have come up with these types of virtual meetings. So we just want to make sure we know who is joining the call. Thank you all for muting your audio. Continue to please be on mute as we continue through the event. And at certain points, we may ask you to unmute your line and participate by participating in the conversation. Please feel free to virtually raise your hand to be recognized by the moderator. We try to see those as much as we can, but with a large group, sometimes we miss them. So, so be patient with us if you have raised your hand. As I mentioned, we do want you to go ahead and pose your questions to us. So please type those into the group chat box so that everyone can see them, so that we can either be answering them right there in the chat box, or we can pose those questions to Dan as we go. Please do not share your screen under any circumstances, again, so that we can make sure that we're focused on the presentation for today and we don't get otherwise distracted. And just a reminder that we're recording all of these meetings so that we can archive them and also share the slides with those who weren't able to join us today. We've had lots of requests for that. So we will be recording this and we'll be able to share this back out to you. Today, as I mentioned, we have joining us our education finance expert here at NCSL who's going to kick us off. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan Thatcher, who's a senior fellow with the education program here at NCSL.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate the introduction, and I hope everyone can hear me well enough. I also want to mention that another education finance expert is joining us today. That is Mike Griffith. And I've asked Mike that wherever he feels appropriate to chime in on what's being presented as well. Also, and I Michelle mentioned this, but we certainly welcome questions or input as we move along too, so that this isn't just me talking and you reading the slides. I prefer to hear what's going on in your states, and that's how we can really learn from each other and what we can expect moving forward as this pandemic progresses. So to start off, as Michelle mentioned, it is worth going back to look at what happened during the Great Recession, which was the greatest economic downturn since the Great Depression. And in all likelihood, the economic impact of what we're seeing today will be very different in flavor from the Great Recession. But there's some important lessons that we've learned going from the beginning of the Great Recession, 32 quarters out, 3 years out, even 4 years out. And a number of researchers have looked at what the impact was on these declining revenues and the economic impact on state revenues, local revenues, but then also on students and student achievements and the financial well-being of school districts. So this is from one study in the journal Education, Finance, and Policy. It was an unprecedented impact on education resources, and districts with a greater dependence on state revenue experienced greater vulnerabilities. And this is somewhat depicted on the graph that you see on the right of your screen, that individual income taxes, corporate income taxes, general sales and gross taxes are much more susceptible to market fluctuations than the property taxes. And there's a number of reasons for that. But primarily the way the structure of property tax works is that it's a tax based on the value of property. And property values tend to remain consistent despite fluctuations in the market. And then the other way is that the way that revenues are collected off of property, that the assessment values are, depending on the state, can occur between 1, 2, 3, even 5 years out. So if there's an interruption in the economy, it's possible that the property valuation that will not get reevaluated even 5 years after the recession began. And then there's some states that just haven't reevaluated their property in decades. So meanwhile, the income and sales tax is very, very volatile. And this is a perfect example of how volatile these tax revenues are. It really, actually, I heard a really great analogy this morning from a tax economist that described the current situation as a car going 80 miles per hour and slamming into a brick wall. And that's our economy right now. That we were going, and it just stopped abruptly. And the question now is, how can we reverse that car, and if we could put the pieces back together, and how to do that in a way to minimize the impact on these districts, for example, that have a greater reliance on state revenue, which again is more volatile than property tax revenue. So the shrinking property tax base that occurred, and this chart shows that occurred as the valuation of houses and our housing stock declined, didn't really show up until later on, a few years out from the beginning of the Great Recession. But the property taxes, the decline in the base was offset by increases in property tax rates. So again, the property tax still was a very consistent source of revenue throughout the Great Recession. But what that meant was that districts that did rely heavily on state revenue, and often these are the districts with that have a lot of low-income families, more often than not, or have they're property poor. They, as their revenues decline, inequality in our state finance systems increased, and as these authors said, it rose dramatically. And again, the final conclusion of these authors was that the federal state fiscal stabilization fund that was part of the ERA package in 2009 offset some of the worst effects of the Great Recession. At the peak of the decline, state revenue for K-12 education was negative 7.2% from what it was at the beginning of the recession. But total revenue was down negative 1%, and that was because of the influx of the state fiscal stabilization fund revenue. And the impact on students and high poverty school districts, as I mentioned, was also great. Two other studies that came out in the last few years, one from David Knight, looked at the impact of the Great Recession on high poverty school districts and found that it significantly reduced, actually, I have these two slides mixed, the columns mixed up. This is the impact on high poverty schools districts is actually on average on average across states, high poverty school districts experienced an inequitable share of funding and staffing cuts following the Great Recession, and that changes in the income-based funding gap varied across states. I apologize for that error. I'll correct these slides before we send them back out. But the impact on student achievement, this is from the Shores and Steinberg study that found that the Great Recession significantly reduced student math and ELA achievement. The effect on student achievement was concentrated among school districts serving more economically disadvantaged minority students. These adverse effects of the recession were not distributed equally among the population of US students. So again, this is in some ways a structure of our school funding systems. And as we've moved to make things more equitable in our school funding systems, we've gone to a greater reliance on state revenue, which is again is more volatile in economic fluctuations. So the trick moving forward is how to mitigate the impact of declining state revenues on districts with a high proportion and concentrations of families living in poverty or dealing with poverty, so that the economic and the academic impacts will be mitigated. And this is another chart that I created for you. If you go to this bit.ly link, you can look at your state taxes state tax performance starting at the beginning of the Great Recession and going to the end of 2002. So if you go to this, you can click on your own state and see how your taxes performed. And these are moving quarterly averages. But the one we're looking at right now is for the United States. And we, by the end of the fourth quarter in 2009, we see the greatest drop in total revenue, state revenue. And these are nominal figures too, by the way, they're not adjusted for inflation. So what we're anticipating moving forward is that like we see with, and I'm not sure if you can see my mouse or not, but the general sales tax dropped quite quickly, along with personal income tax collections. And we anticipate that these drops will be much more precipitous moving forward in the next few months, which will of course have an impact on the next fiscal year and budgeting and planning for the next fiscal year. This is another reflection of how our reliance on state revenue for funding K-12 system writ large has changed over the years. The proportion seems to be pretty consistent, which is the graph that you're looking at on the left. And this is from data collected from NEA's estimates and rankings that they produce out every year for 2018-19 figures. The rest of the figures are from the National Center for Education Statistics, and this is looking at combined local and state revenue as a whole on the country. And there's quite consistent parity between these two resources. But if you look at actual dollars, this is the screen or the chart on the right. This is from Marguerite Rosa, a blog that she had in the Brookings Institute last week, I believe, looking at the changes in revenue from the states since 2007 to 2017. And again, we see more fluctuations of overall dollars from states with the intent through finance reforms to provide greater equity throughout the entire and finance system of the state. But again, as we do these, we also introduce more volatility in revenue into our systems. And here's just one more slide depicting what I've been driving home before. And this is from, these are maps taken from the National Center for Education Statistics. So you can see your state on this, on these maps. This is looking at the total revenues for K-12 education and what percent comes from the state on the left and then property taxes on the right. I'm going to pause real quick to see if anyone has any comments or questions at this point in time.
If you'd like to ask a question, you can either unmute yourself or you can type it in the chat box.
I will go ahead and move on to what we're seeing today. Most of this information I do credit to Dr. Marguerite Rosa at the Edgenomics Lab through at Georgetown, who works very closely with school districts across the country. And she's been on the phone with a lot of the fiscal leaders in these districts and collecting some of the information that she's hearing from them. A couple of weeks ago, she was saying that they're not spending as much money as they would be from a fiscal year prior before this one. And that's because they're not spending as much on things like substitutes or graduation events, banquets, some of these items that would be happening now, which they're not. So there may be some end of year cash balances, but there's also the districts who are spending a lot of money to buy the digital infrastructure needed for distance learning. And so I don't know if we really have a good idea of which districts these are and which districts aren't having to make these investments. So I think districts are kind of all over the place in how their the end of the school year or fiscal year is going to look for them. If they do have a cash balance, it's important that they have the opportunity to carry forward that balance to the next school year or next fiscal year. So according to Dr. Rose's analysis of this, we'll see states that have fewer funds for districts moving forward in the next fifth school year. And as for reasons that I just went over, also reduced teacher turnover drives up salary costs as more experienced teachers stay around, and if we do have teacher furloughs or layoffs, it tends to be those who are laid off are the younger teachers. And then students living in poverty with greater needs. These are all pressures on district budgets. We're also seeing that pension funds are seeing greater gaps. In a report just last week from Moody's, there was an estimate that $1 trillion has been lost in pension value alone after the decline in the stock market. And then districts will have further pressures because they'll in likelihood see more students coming into their schools as parents have less money to pay for private schooling for their children, and they'll send them to public schools. So some people have referred to this, some finance experts have referred to this as the double whammy. Greater expenses go up and revenues drop. Again, from Marguerite Rosa, showing that it doesn't take much to destabilize district finances. And again, I'd like to draw from her data because she works so closely with school districts and has a real sense for the pressures that impact them. Even with budget increases, many districts still feel constrained. That's why you'll often hear frustration from state policymakers when they've added a lot of money or augmented their revenue to K-12 education, but districts are saying they still are being pinched at the local level. But this is for a number of reasons. Labor feels like fixed costs for them. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, that all these effects are augmented and disproportionately felt by high poverty schools, and where a lot of our youngest junior teachers are located. And fulfilled positions remain empty, and student needs are increasing. as the economy continues to impact the parents and the guardians of our children. So more on what we can expect moving forward. And I've been thinking about this as a cascading effect, and I'm not sure if I'm totally wedded to this notion of it, but it seems that now we are, because the economy has crashed into the wall, terrible analogy perhaps, but our sales tax revenue is really just come to a grinding halt. And then we are also, states are having, and districts are having unanticipated expenditures to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. This really is an unprecedented time because of the nature of this recession, being coupled with a global pandemic. So that's what we can expect for the close of fiscal year 2020. And there's some indication from what we see from you and your states that there's some gaps that do need to be closed for fiscal year 2020. In 12 states, we've seen have made withdrawals from the rainy day funds already to close gaps for fiscal year 2020. And then as we move into fiscal year 2021, or school year 2021, the next school year, the impact of declining personal tax revenues coupled with the sagging sales tax revenue will impact our budgets. And that will be again combined with more expenditures to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19. And it's projected that our Medicaid enrollments will also increase, placing further pressure on state budgets. And then we expect that this will carry with us at least until school year 2021 to 22. And this is the graph you see on the right is from analysis by EdWeek looking at 4 different states and what they're looking at moving into the next fiscal year. And some quotes to add to that. And I'll just state one quote here from State Senator Moreno in Colorado. He said to Colorado Public Radio that I would say it feels like the rug got pulled out from under us. And really there, it's interesting because Colorado, like a number of other states, were looking into a major finance overhaul. And those states that were hoping to have a large reform of their education finance system may be having the rug pulled out from underneath them. And here again, I'd be happy to hear from anyone on the call who of those states that were considering major reforms to their ed finance system, if those efforts will still go forward or not. It's just completely changed the dynamic in what we were thinking about education finance just even 3 months ago. And then we are fortunate to have Mike Griffith with us that did an analysis that was also highlighted in EdWeek last week, I believe, on numbers that he ran on the impact of the CARES Act for K-12 education, something we haven't really hit upon yet. Mike, may I turn it over to you for a few minutes now?
Sure, thanks, Dan. Yeah, so I was asked by EdWeek. I actually had put this analysis together just so I can get my own head around what's going on right now. What are we looking at in state budgets and how much will the CARES Act be helping? I do feel like right now, anything I do is outdated within 24 to 48 hours. So even this analysis I've done an update of, so I have slightly different numbers that are out there for this analysis. Some of it is just trying to get a handle on how much of the federal dollars will actually go to education, because there's some flexibility there where the governors can decide on their pot of money, how much will go to K-12 education versus higher ed, and then how much of that, even when it goes to K-12, will go to specific districts versus being spread out to all districts in the state. That's going to be up to each governor to make those decisions. But when you look at some of these numbers, you can see that it's, $315 per pupil. I've adjusted that now down to $270 per pupil. But you can see the range of where the dollars are going. Utah at the lowest at $147 per pupil. DC at 527. This really has to do with the fact that these dollars were distributed based on Title I Part A money. And so the higher percentage or higher amount you get per pupil in Title I Part A, the higher amount you're going to get from this Recovery Act. It was not, essentially they did not have enough time on Capitol Hill to adjust this based on how you're being impacted economically or what your student needs are. So they didn't really look at state needs or student needs other than the fact they looked at Title I Part A distribution. What we're finding is when we start looking at these numbers that if the state funding decreases for education are below 5%, this money essentially combined with state reserves will cover the cost and will allow the 2020-21 school year to go ahead without any cuts. But the more I talk to people in states, the more I'm looking at the data, it's going to be greater than a 5% decrease in most states. I also based all of my assumptions on the fact that any cuts for this current school year could be made up through state reserve accounts. We're starting to see that that might not be the case. That even though overall nationally we have some of the highest balances we've ever had for state reserve accounts, it isn't sufficient in some states to cover the cuts that they need to make. So, you know, there are, as Dan said, some savings that will be produced because the school year has gone online in most places, but those costs will be small in comparison. Just as a reminder, about 60 to 65% of state expenditures go to teacher salaries and benefits, about another 15 to 20% go to other salaries and benefits. And what we've heard from districts is they're reluctant to lay off anyone right now. So that means about 80% of these ed budgets have not been touched because they're going to salaries and benefits. Transportation funding has been reduced in most of these places, but not by a significant enough amount to make up for the added expenses for things like moving to online learning, increased technology cost, and increased cost in things like food delivery for low-income families. And as Dan said, one of the other things is we're taking a look at this is as the unemployment numbers climb, the percentage of kids who will now qualify for free and reduced price lunch goes up, and those expenses for school districts will increase. So, you know, I feel like I could kind of go on, and Dan probably does too, about all the bad news that is out there. But, you know, if you simply look at the unemployment numbers today that we have, it's about 15% unemployment rate, which greatly exceeds anything that we had during the last economic downturn. So the end of all this is the federal money helped, but it is not sufficient enough to get us past what we're looking at. And we probably could really use an additional federal stimulus just for education like we had during the economic downturn of 2007, 2008.
Thank you very much, Mike. This is really a novel analysis that we haven't seen anyone else do around the country. And I tend to be more optimistic, and when Mike and I often present together and we kind of have the shtick where he's a little more looking at the kind of the downs. Well, look, I'm a little more optimistic sometimes. Mike's more real and will tell you the straight story. But I'm having a hard time too finding the silver lining in all this. But hopefully I can end with some kind of silver lining moving forward. And Mike left with the idea that what we are receiving from the federal government right now in aid is only mitigating. It's not a stabilization amount of finance that we saw in the Great Recession. But one point of maybe advice that was given to a budget advisor for Richard Nixon and President Nixon, President Ford, Feidler, he said that with revenues, you have to forecast and forecast often. And if you try to forecast the future, you're going to end up eating the crystal from your crystal ball. So one thing that states can do right now, until there is a perhaps further fiscal stabilization from the federal government, is provide your budget writers forecasts on your state revenues as often as you can, so that states can make as informed decisions about what revenue is available or maybe coming in. Just having more data at this point will be helpful. Mike?
Just something really quick. I noticed that somebody had a question about, they're one of the 3 states that in my analysis wouldn't see a decrease. Dan, I'll make my analysis available to you, and then you can hand it out to anyone who would like to take a look at it. And the way it works is it's a spreadsheet that I created, and you can adjust what you think the cut in your state is going to be, just to get a general idea about what that's going to mean for education in your state, and then how do the Fed dollars work against that. I'll also say I'm working on another analysis right now that looks at what would be the impact on teaching positions. I got a lot of questions about that. And so right now, if it were a 10% budget cut, I'm estimating that it would be about 278,000 lost teaching positions in the country. So, and again, I don't know if that 10% number is realistic or if it's low or if it's high, but that's, again, I've set that spreadsheet up. So when that is available, I'll release it to Dan, and then Dan can release it to any of you that would like to see it.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, we'll make sure to make that available to you as soon as we can. And one other comment on that I mentioned earlier that as a whole, as an aggregate for the nation, we at the peak of the Great Recession, state revenues declined 7.2%, and we're probably on track to surpass that at the peak of the pain here. So I have this question about how will it be distributed if there is a second or a fiscal stabilization fund for this, a second one for this recession coming from the federal government. Because in 2009 and 10, the state fiscal stabilization fund was distributed based upon states' existing funding formula. And if there were existing inequities structurally in that funding formula, the money was distributed based upon those structural inequities. So I think whatever happens at the federal level, the decision in the law that how it's going to be distributed ought to be advised by the history of the state fiscal stabilization fund in ERA and the impact that it had. So this is more looking at what can be done moving forward. Again, forecast and forecast often. Ask your state, why did inequality increase during the Great Recession? And these are for states where your districts that do rely heavily on state dollars. What can be done to mitigate the impact on those districts that won't have the same kind of capacity to raise revenue at the local level? There again, the way the property tax works, the rates may go up higher in a property poor district, but the revenue from those higher rates will not be sufficient to make up for lost state revenue. Whereas the property wealthy districts were able to raise marginally rates and generate enough revenue to really make up or exceed, in some cases, the drops in state revenue, which then impacted statewide equity from district to district. How can the impacts of vulnerable children, families, and communities be mitigated? And this is another way or another way, a question that can be asked at this moment. And there's some really new, interesting data sets that can be used at this point. There's from Raj Chetty, he has the Opportunity Atlas that looks at the opportunity from zip code to zip code, neighborhood to neighborhood in every state, and what is the opportunity for children based upon background, race, ethnicity, income levels, And there's an opportunity for states to look at these kinds of data sets. There's also the Stanford Education Data set called CETA that has similar information, and the U.S. Census, or the National Center for Education Statistics, or IES, through IES, is also working on a similar data set that's being used for identifying schools and districts that have concentrations of poverty, really for funding purposes and for distribution of free and reduced price meals. And that's an opportunity for states to look at, to use these rich data sets that are neighborhood specific to see if there's a way to distribute resources, targeted resources, knowing that we have limited revenues. Then, is there a way to make equitable cuts or preserve what equity does exist in our current finance systems? This is, again, looking at the balance between which districts, the balance between state and local revenue from district to district. And we have now, most states use some measure of poverty in their funding formulas or through categorical aid to greater revenue to districts with high concentrations of poverty. And can similar metrics be used to mitigate the cuts to districts? Or, I think there's some opportunities here using what innovations have come in education finance formulas since the Great Recession to look at making the impact less impactful on the students who we know will inevitably suffer the most through a recession. And again, we're talking about knowing that these impacts will be felt in student learning, in graduation rates, adult income, average adult income earnings. So the other options that we was looking at are whether states can, or how, as I just mentioned, how can or should they identify schools and districts, the ones who are in the need most immediately, and thinking about this as being because this is such a different, novel crisis that we're facing. There's vulnerability. Districts who are particularly vulnerable those would be the districts with high concentrations of families living with the effects of poverty. And then there's districts with real immediate needs and those who are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And these districts may not be the same, they may overlap, but I think there's two different things that we need to be looking at as states, is those that would be vulnerable because of existing levels of poverty in the district, and then needs just based on where there's impact or outbreaks of COVID-19, whether they need disproportionate or extra state revenue or resources in those districts. So these are questions that I've basically have posed to you. And let's see, one last thing, and would love to hear your thoughts on some of these questions that I've posed, and whether they're realistic or what you think, or what are the conversations you're having in your states. The other idea, and this came from a call we had with LESN last week from California, was they're financially triaging, not financially, but they're triaging their policies right now and their legislation. What legislation is needed right now, it's down the line in a triage setting. So, this is another question I posed to you throughout all this. Should we be triaging our districts and identifying districts based upon the vulnerability plus need, and doing that kind of looking through those lenses to see what districts we should really be triaging, and which ones kind of meet at different thresholds along need. We have also a number of resources that we'll get more into after questions or comments. But this one I do want to highlight quickly, because if you go here, you can look at the bills that have been enacted in your states that do address funding or appropriations, rainy day transfers, these kinds of bills and see what other states are doing. So this bill database is being updated every day pretty well, if not more often, as we identify bills and add them to this data set. And any questions, please feel free to call me or email me about what is in here, or if you see something from your state that's not in there, so we can get everything added. But again, we're updating this and going through the legislation now to make sure it's up to date. And we will try to keep this up to date on a daily basis as well as we can moving forward. I'm going to pause there then and see if we have any comments or questions.
We do. So first, let's take some questions, and then we would like to open it up for discussion to hear from you all what you're hearing in your state about budget projections and potential impact on education. But one thing that I will say that occurred to me while Dan and Mike were both speaking is that it's going to be very crucial that you have information on what we know from research about what works to ensure that students have what they need to grow up to be prepared for both college and career. And we know that you're going to be making some tough decisions. We know that you're going to be working with school districts that'll be making tough decisions. And so it's important to have the information and research at your fingertips to ensure that you can make well-informed decisions when you have to make those difficult choices. So we will do whatever we can to help you and to get some research and information out there to remind you about what we know about what is most impactful for students and how cuts can potentially impact students. So let's first take a question from the chat box. As a reminder, please go ahead and type your questions over there for now. And then we'll, if we have some time, we'll open it up for a little bit of discussion. The first question comes from Jeffrey. Has there been success in utilizing concepts like opportunity weights or to mitigate funding inequities based on free and reduced price lunches to better target funding? Let's see, Dan or Mike?
Yeah, I'll make one comment, and then I'd love to hear what Mike has to say about this as well. But the opportunity weights that referencing particularly the Raj Chetty data set, and we also have a question about these data sets, and I will add them with links to them in this PowerPoint before we send it back out, so that you can have links to those and use them, or let your staff use them, either way. But the more granular data hasn't been used in state funding formulas. Texas has something getting at this in House Bill 2 that enacted earlier, or actually now last year, in their new funding formula, where it does get a little more granular. And so a lot of this is to replace the reliance on free and reduced price lunch eligibility, knowing that it's becoming less and less of a reliable indicator of poverty as a proxy of poverty from district to district. And this is largely because of the introduction of the community eligibility provision, which really revamps the school lunch program. And what it does in a nutshell, enacted in 2015, it allows some schools I'm not going to get too technical, but based upon a direct certification of need, a certain population of these students who have some direct certification of need, to allow the whole school where these students are free lunch. So if there's a threshold met that the school has, for example, 60% of its students who are on TANF or receive SNAP benefits, then the entire school population will get the free meals. And what this means is that the more often that districts or states, or excuse me, schools are opting into this federal program, the less and less number of students are identified as free or reduced price lunch, which then impacts the reliability of that metric in funding formulas for distributing compensatory aid or at-risk aid or something like that. So I don't know if I'm answering exactly what you're getting at too, but there's also the notion of whether these funds have impacted student learning and adult outcomes and whatnot down the road. And there's some interesting research about that. But I can post some links to that on the PowerPoint too before we release it. Mike, would you want to comment on that at all?
No, I think you hit on it, Dan. This is the trend we've been seeing. States are moving away from free and reduced price lunch. They're kind of moving one way or the other. States are looking at using census data now and kind of getting rid of the individual data collection because you can't use free and reduced price lunch. Other states are looking at using other markers outside of free and reduced price lunch. One of the issues you sort of have with the other markers is they do a really good job of capturing who are your very low income kids, but they don't do a great job on capturing who are the working poor kids. And that's the, kids from, I should say, working poor families. And so that's what the reduced price lunch number did a great job. And so states are really struggling with that right now. And they have been for about the last 5-6 years as they're making this transition. But yeah, I think you hit on most of the major points there, Dan.
We have another question that comes from Representative Horman in Idaho. Dan, will you restate or email the data sets you mentioned we could refer to that would help us analyze equity impact? I remember Stanford was one of them.
Yeah, and there's 3 different ones. And I will add those to the presentation, but in short, there's the Opportunity Atlas, and if you Google that, and Raj Chetty is at Harvard, that's one, and then the Stanford Education Data, I forget what the A stands for, but it's SEDA, and that is, I want to say Kenneth Shores is leading up that project, and then the U.S. Department of Education is also working on a granular analysis. And these are really interesting because they're using GIS technology and combining them with longitudinal data sets available from the U.S. Census Bureau, along with other government data sets that are similar data sets that have been used to look at the impact of the impact long-term on districts that have increased spending on students. So there's a lot of research out from Carabo Jackson, Rucker Johnson, others that have looking at the long-term impact of investments in K-12 education and trying to link those to adult outcomes rather than just looking at whether scores on NAEP increase or whatnot. So it's getting much more granular, and the data sets are becoming much finer and much more in depth as really the longitudinal nature of them is giving researchers a lot more data to statistically refine their analyses.
Okay, we have a question from Andy DeBuer. Do we know yet if the CARES Act funds for education can be used to offset state revenue loss, or are they only for reimbursing actual costs? I'm going to ask Dan to comment, but Austin, feel free to jump in here too. Austin Reed is on the line, and he is our federal education expert.
And I absolutely defer to Austin on this question.
Yeah, that's actually a good question, and it's a timely one. There are 2 funding streams in CARES that relate to education. There's the K12 fund and there's the governor's fund. Let's start with the K12 fund. We're expecting guidance from the department, hopefully within the next week, on how exactly those can be used. But based on how the CARES Act reads, it suggests that those funds are really meant to be response activities to emergency needs that have come up due to COVID-19, not really to backfill any general revenue that a school might be losing. However, with the governor's fund, the department just released guidance this afternoon, and the guidance basically said that these funds, the department wasn't going to micromanage the use of these funds, and that what the law said in terms of use of funds would stand. And so a governor is able to use those funds to provide emergency grants to K-12 schools, higher ed institutions, any education-related entity in the state to support, I can pull the language up here, it's to support the ongoing functionality of those institutions. I think that's the exact language that the guidance and the statute uses, which suggests that that could be used to offset state revenue losses. And the department hasn't provided, I mean, their guidance was pretty broad. And so, from my read of that, then yeah, you could use the governor's fund to offset costs, whereas the K-12 funds are probably going to be a little more towards reimbursing costs that have already occurred or are occurring because of the emergency, although there's some language in there in the K-12 that says that the funds could be used for other activities that are necessary to maintain the operation of and continuity of services in schools. That could be interpreted maybe broadly, and perhaps that could be a clause that would allow these funds to provide general relief to schools. But, my read is that the K-12 funds are a little more restrictive. And then the overall $150 billion to states is really restrictive. It's not to be used for, it's only to be used to respond to the coronavirus rather than to backfill revenue.
Thank you, Austin. And I presume that answers Natalie Heath's question as well, but if not, be sure to indicate so in the chat box. The next question comes from Sonny Liu. Did any states reconfigure or diversify their revenue source after the Great Recession, particularly those with a high state share of funding for schools, to stabilize funding streams for schools?
Well, there haven't been many new taxes adopted that are sufficient to offset or mitigate the vulnerability of the sales and income tax. There's been a lot of hype around taxing cannabis. I have a great slide that I can send out to that using an analysis showing what revenues would be generated state by state if they legalized cannabis, and then applied that to current school revenues, and is just really 1% add on to the revenues already out there for K-12 education, 1 to 3% at the most. But that's something. It's that it can equate to millions of dollars in some states, like a state like New York. But the other option that is really diversifying your existing revenues. And I did one analysis before this, looking at states that had income tax, that didn't have an income tax, or states that didn't have a sales tax, and how long it took for the revenues to recover after the Great Recession. And it was clear that states that had a broader mix of taxes fared better in the recovery out of the Great Recession. So having a diverse pool of revenues is certainly helpful. But yeah, there's just I think we've really we have a 20th century tax system based out of the world. They really came to being after World War II, and there haven't been major revisions to it since then. And so we have primarily a tax structure that taxes output, not the services that is reflective of our service related economy. So Mike, I know, has some things to say about that if he wants to add anything, but we haven't seen a lot of new big infusions of revenue for schools come in because our big three, property, sales, and income, are really pretty well tapped at this point.
No, I agree with you, Dan, and my answer to that question would have been a lot simpler. It just would have been no. There have not been changes. We know it, and this is one of those things. We know over-reliance on things like sales and income tax makes you more vulnerable to upturns and downturns in the economy. But there's really not that much we can do about it. They still control between the two about 90% of state revenue from taxes nationally comes from those two. I just looked that number up this morning because I had to put it in a report, but it is, one of these things that Dan's right. It's an older tax system, but it's one that we have, and we just sort of have to deal with what we have. The states that do have, and there's not many of them, a reliance on statewide property taxes can insulate themselves a little better. But when you look at states like Vermont and Michigan, and to a lesser extent, Washington and a couple other states that do have a statewide property tax that they use at least in part for education, it helps to insulate them at least a little bit for that. But otherwise, most states, it is the sales and the income tax. And in a couple of states, and you know who you are, it's just sales or just income. So
I just typed a question in the chat box, and while we're wrapping up here, I would love for everyone who's on the call to take a moment to input this information. We have a record of the chat, so this is really helpful for us. Our fiscal affairs folks are collecting this, but it's good for us to see this too, and for you to see it. My question was, what do you anticipate to be the loss in revenue for your state? Is it 10%? Is it 15%? Is it 20%? If you could just take a moment to type in the chat box what you're hearing, or what at least the forecast is for right now, that's somewhat helpful for us so that we can get a sense of what everyone's thinking and hearing out there. So I wanted to remind, Dan, could you advance the slide for me?
Sure.
One more. I wanted to remind everyone about the resources that we have at NCSL and the meetings that we have coming up. First of all, we have a COVID-19 page that has information on any policy area you can think of that might be impacted by COVID, including the legislative sessions themselves. And we also have a lot of information that we've been gathering on the education front. We've been writing chats, we've been trying to dissect what's going on at the federal level and just get information from you to you as quickly as we can. So we encourage you to check out the COVID-19 page on the NCSL website and link to the education, or click on the education tile to get all those resources. We have just added a page that has a link to all of these virtual meetings. It has the dates. We may have to reschedule some of these and move these around a little bit, so we'll always make sure this is up to date. We send the information out a week at a time so that we can make sure that those links to the virtual meetings stay as safe and secure as they can and are only shared with people who are supposed to be on the meetings, and we send them to you via email. We don't post them online for that very purpose. We will, however, post the archived recording of this meeting, as well as links to the PowerPoint and any additional information that we may want to share with you. So if you look at this information that's on the screen right now, you can see a hyperlink to that very first meeting. You can click on there when you get the PowerPoint, or you can go to our website and find all of that information. Coming up later this week, we have on Friday a discussion about schools are closed, now what? What does this mean for education in P12 and in higher ed? We're going to look at what is sort of the state of things right now. What will legislators have to be thinking about pretty quickly within the next 6 months or so? And then what are legislators and education officials going to have to be thinking about long term? And so we will have that discussion on Friday. All of these are always at 3 p.m. Eastern time. Next week, we'll start to dive into some issues around equity, or efforts to ensure that all students have access to education. We know that this effort in school districts is being dramatically impacted right now with the implementation of distance learning. So we're going to hear from some experts about how it is that students with disabilities and English learners are being reached right now, and what is the impact on this shift that we're having to make right now. And I dare say maybe even a little bit anyway this fall. And then this topic of the technology divide that has been around forever and is right now, right smack back in front of us. How do we ensure that all students have access to both internet and the devices that they need? And should we be concerned about data privacy at this point? those are the topics we'll be discussing next week. And then we will continue with our series. We already have identified additional discussions that we know we're going to have. So as I said, this agenda and series of meetings, we'll be shifting these a little bit and we'll be adding to them as well. If you have an idea for a topic that's not on here, but you think is very pressing and state legislators and staff really need to know about it, please let us know. We'd love to hear about it. And as you're going about your work right now, please let us know if you need us to do any research for you, or if you need information on what other states are doing. And if you want to be connected to other legislators and staff in other states, we're happy to connect you one-on-one or even in a small group to get the folks who are dealing with similar things together. That would be really helpful. Thank you so much for attending today's meeting, and we will have the archive up and posted hopefully by late tomorrow from this particular meeting, and then please join us on Friday. Thank you and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.